The house was a picture of suburban peace, a two-story beige box with perfectly manicured hedges and a lawn that looked like a green carpet. But the boy in the upstairs window wasn't looking out at the world. He was looking in, with the haunted, watchful eyes of a prisoner checking the perimeter. Elias Thorne saw him from the curb, his duffel bag slung over a shoulder that still ached from the weight of body armor and the memory of a war a world away. For a moment, the boy was just a boy. Then he raised a small hand to the glass, and the afternoon sun caught the raw, red abrasion circling his wrist, stark against his pale skin. The front door opened before Elias could move, and his sister-in-law, Clara, stood framed in the doorway, a vision of curated perfection. Her smile was bright, her blonde hair was immaculate, and her condolences about his late return from deployment were as smooth and practiced as a politician's handshake. She had been his wife's sister, the one Sarah had always worried about, the one who chased an impossible standard of order in a chaotic world. Now, she was the sole guardian of Sarah's son, Leo. "Elias, we were so excited you were finally coming home," Clara said, her voice a melody of welcome that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Leo, come say hello to your uncle." The boy, Leo, drifted down the stairs with a silence that was unnatural for a 6-year-old. He was a ghost in his own home. He wore a long-sleeved shirt, Elias noted, despite the unseasonable warmth of the autumn day. Elias knelt, the familiar protest of his knee a grounding sensation in the sudden, unnerving sterility of the house. It didn't smell like a home. There was no scent of baking or dust or life. Only the sharp, chemical sting of lemon polish and bleach, an antiseptic odor that scrubbed the air clean of any personality. He opened his arms for a hug. Leo hesitated, his eyes darting to his mother for a fraction of a second before stepping into the embrace. It was like holding a bundle of sticks, stiff and unyielding. As the boy pulled back, the cuff of his shirt rode up an inch, revealing the full extent of the mark on his wrist. It wasn't a scrape. It was a friction burn, angry and inflamed, as if a rope or a rough strap had been cinched tight around his small arm. "He had a nasty fall near the rose bushes last week," Clara said, her voice breezing past the awkward silence. A perfectly timed explanation for a question Elias hadn't yet asked. "Scraped himself up something awful, my little adventurer," she tousled Leo's hair. A gesture that should have been affectionate but looked possessive, a claim of ownership. Leo didn't react. He simply stood there, a silent statue in the cold, polished foyer. Elias straightened up, his gaze holding Clara's for a beat too long. The soldier in him, the part that had spent years assessing threats and reading deceptive terrain, was screaming. A fall didn't create perfectly symmetrical abrasions. Rose bushes didn't leave marks like shackles. He looked from Clara's placid, smiling face to the vast, empty quiet of her home. He remembered this house when Sarah was alive, when it was filled with the echoes of their laughter and the comfortable clutter of a life well lived. He remembered a younger Leo, a rambunctious toddler who filled every room with his noise and his mess, a whirlwind of pure, unadulterated childhood. The boy before him was a stranger, a carefully edited version of the child he remembered, with all the life and color muted. Elias forced a nod, a tight smile that felt like a mask. He was home, but he had just walked into a new kind of war zone, one with no clear enemy lines and a single silent victim he'd promised his dying wife he would always protect. The dinner that evening was a masterpiece of tension, served on pristine white plates that seemed to amplify the silence. Clara had prepared a roasted chicken with rosemary potatoes and green beans, a meal of such wholesome perfection it felt like a prop in a stage play. Leo sat opposite Elias, his back ramrod straight, his small hands holding his fork and knife with a rigid formality that belonged in an etiquette class, not at a family dinner. He cut his food into tiny, precise squares, chewing each one with a slow, deliberate rhythm, his eyes fixed on his plate. He didn't speak. He didn't fidget. He existed as a small, contained unit of compliance. When Elias asked him about school, Leo offered a quiet, "It's fine," his gaze flickering toward Clara before returning to his plate, a silent request for approval. The first crack in the flawless veneer came when Leo reached for his glass of water. His fingers, small and slightly clumsy, knocked it off balance. A small amount of water, no more than a tablespoon, sloshed onto the polished wood of the table. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. All color drained from Leo's face. His breath hitched. He froze completely, his eyes wide with a primal terror that was wildly disproportionate to the minor infraction. It was the look of a soldier who had just stepped on a pressure plate. Clara's smile tightened by a millimeter. "Oh, little man," she said, her voice a silken threat. "Accidents happen. We just have to be more careful, don't we? Cleanliness is so important." She rose and retrieved a cloth, wiping the spill with 3 swift, aggressive strokes. The books on his nightstand were organized not by title, but by the color of their spines, forming a perfect rainbow gradient. It was the room of a child who had learned not to play, not to create a mess, not to leave a trace of his own existence. Elias tried to forge a connection in the one place that felt less controlled: the backyard. He found Leo sitting on a swing, motionless, his hands gripping the chains. Elias walked over and gave the swing a gentle push. For a single, breathtaking moment, Leo's body relaxed, and he leaned back into the motion. A ghost of a smile, a genuine flicker of childish delight, touched his lips. "I remember when you couldn't get enough of this swing," Elias said softly. "You used to try and touch the clouds." He was about to ask Leo about the drawing he'd seen in the window, about the mark on his wrist, when Clara's voice sliced through the crisp air from the back door. "Leo, darling, time to come inside now. You need to wash up for your scheduled reading time. Don't bother your uncle, he's tired from his trip." The smile was gone from Leo's face. The brief moment of freedom vanished. He dutifully slid off the swing and walked toward the house, his shoulders hunched. The connection was severed as cleanly as a sniper's shot. That night, sleep was an impossibility. Elias lay in the sterile guest room, staring at the ceiling, the house's oppressive silence pressing down on him. He unlocked his phone and scrolled through old photos until he found the one he was looking for. It was from Leo's 3rd birthday, a year before Sarah got sick. In the photo, Elias was holding a giggling Leo, who was covered from head to toe in chocolate cake and blue frosting. Sarah stood beside them, her arm around Elias, laughing so hard her eyes were squeezed shut. They were messy, chaotic, and incandescently happy. The memory was a physical ache, a visceral reminder of what had been lost. Sarah had made him promise. "Clara had it so rough growing up, Eli," she'd whispered, her voice weak in those final days. "Promise me you'll look out for her. Promise me you'll make sure Leo is happy," he had promised. He had been so focused on looking out for Clara that he had failed to see he needed to look out for Leo, from her. He had failed his wife in her dying wish. A cold, hard resolve settled over him, the familiar feeling of a mission objective locking into place. He would not fail again. Elias needed an outside perspective, a pair of eyes that had been watching this quiet street long before he had returned. He remembered Mrs. Gable, the elderly woman who lived next door, a fixture of the neighborhood who tended her prize-winning roses with a fierce devotion. The next morning, feigning a need for fresh air, he went for a walk and timed it to accidentally cross paths with her as she knelt by her flower beds. She greeted him warmly, her weathered face crinkling into a smile as she offered condolences for his wife and welcomed him home. He steered the conversation gently, asking about the neighborhood, about how things had been. At the mention of Leo, a shadow passed over her kind eyes. "He's gotten so quiet," she said, her voice dropping as she snipped a dead leaf from a rosebush. "It's not right." Elias waited, his silence an invitation. It was a technique he'd learned in interrogation, letting the other person fill the void. "After your Sarah passed, well, Clara is very particular. The house is always perfect. The lawn is perfect." She paused, looking over her shoulder at the silent beige house as if it might be listening. "But you never hear him anymore, you know? Kids are supposed to make noise. Laughter, shouting, crying. There's none of that. It's just quiet." Elias looked at her, his gaze steady. "Have you seen anything?" he asked, his voice low. Mrs. Gable hesitated, twisting a gardening glove in her hands. He could see the conflict in her face, the desire not to get involved versus a deep-seated sense of wrongness. I don't want to cause trouble, she began. But one day this summer it was pouring rain, a real thunderstorm, and I saw him. She pointed with her trowel toward Clara's pristine flagstone porch. Little Leo. He was out there on his hands and knees with a bucket and a scrub brush, scrubbing the steps. In the pouring rain. He couldn't have been more than 5 at the time. When I called over to ask Clara what on earth was going on, she just smiled from the doorway and said he was learning the importance of chores. She called it character building. Mrs. Gable shook her head, her expression pained. His little hands were red and raw, Elias. It wasn't right. The validation sent a chill through him. It wasn't just his gut feeling. It was a pattern. Armed with Mrs. Gable's testimony, Elias felt a new urgency. Later that day, while Clara was occupied on a long, tense business call in her home office, he told Leo he wanted to find an old picture book Sarah had bought him. It was a plausible excuse to be in the boys' room alone. He moved with quiet purpose, his instincts honed by years of searching rooms for hidden threats. He checked the closet, behind the perfectly organized books. Nothing. He ran his hand along the baseboards. Then a primal instinct took over. He knelt by the bed and lifted the corner of the mattress. Tucked deep underneath, flattened against the box spring, was a single sheet of folded construction paper. He carefully unfolded it. The drawing was done in crayon, with the unrefined, earnest strokes of a small child. On one side of the paper was a bright yellow sun with a huge smile, surrounded by a blue sky and green grass. A happy picture. Hope tightened in Elias's chest. Then he turned it over. The reverse side was a nightmare. A small stick figure, clearly meant to be a boy, stood in the center of a dark, square room. There were no windows or doors. The walls were scribbled over with angry, chaotic slashes of red and black crayon. Next to the small boy stood a tall, thin figure with a featureless face and long, stringy hair, unmistakably Clara. In the tall figure's hand was a long object, a stick or a rod, with jagged scribbles at the end, like bristles. It was a brush. Below the drawing, in shaky, barely legible letters, Leo had written a single word. Dirty Elias stared at the drawing, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. This wasn't just a child's doodle. It was a testimony. It was a map of his prison and a portrait of his jailer. Later, Elias rejoined Clara downstairs. He held her gaze as he spoke, testing her. It was nice to see Mrs. Gable this morning, he said casually. She seems to be keeping well. Clara's polite smile didn't waver, but for a split second, her eyes went as cold and hard as polished stone. She's a dear old thing, she replied, her voice smooth as glass. A bit of a busybody, though. Her imagination runs away with her sometimes. The dismissal was too practiced, too swift. It was the sound of a lie that had been told many times before. Elias just nodded, tucking the observation away. He now had a witness and an exhibit of evidence. The cracks in the wall were starting to show, and he knew, with chilling certainty, that behind them lay something rotten. The next day, Elias enacted the first part of his plan. He told Clara he needed to drive into the city to meet with an old army buddy, an excuse that would grant him several hours of freedom. He drove 2 blocks away, parked where he had a clear view of her house, and waited. An hour later, Clara emerged, dressed in a sharp business suit, got into her luxury sedan, and drove off, likely to a lunch meeting or a board presentation. Another part of her meticulously curated life. Elias gave her 10 minutes, then circled the block. He let himself in the front door with a spare key Sarah had given him years ago, a key he had never imagined using like this. The silence inside was absolute, a dead, sterile vacuum. He was behind enemy lines. His target was Clara's private space, the master bedroom and bathroom. He moved with a soldier's efficiency, checking the obvious places first, the nightstands, the closet, under the bed. Everything was impersonal and obsessively neat, as if no one actually lived there. He entered the ensuite bathroom. It gleamed, white tile and chrome fixtures reflecting a cold, sterile light. He scanned the vanity, the medicine cabinet. Nothing but expensive cosmetics and neatly folded towels. Then his eyes fell to the cabinet under the sink. He opened it. Behind a row of brand-name cleaning products, tucked away in the back corner, was a small, gray metal box with a simple key lock. It was out of place in the otherwise perfect bathroom. Adrenaline, cold and familiar, coursed through him. The lock was cheap. He retrieved a multi-tool from his pocket and, with a bit of pressure, popped the lid open. His breath caught in his throat. He had expected to find something overtly sinister. A strap, a paddle. The reality was somehow worse, more twisted. Inside the box lay 3 objects. The first was a set of stiff-bristled scrubbing brushes, the kind designed for scouring grout and tile, their bristles hard and unforgiving. The second was a half-empty bottle of industrial-strength cleaning concentrate, the warning label featuring stark symbols for corrosive and irritant. The third item was a small, black leather-bound journal. His hands shaking with a rage he could barely contain, he opened the journal. The pages were filled with Clara's perfect, looping cursive. It wasn't a diary of emotions. It was a ledger of sins. Each entry was dated and detailed one of Leo's infractions. October 12th. Leo tracked a small amount of mud onto the kitchen floor, a sign of carelessness and disrespect for a clean home. October 17th. A juice stain on the living room rug, a manifestation of his innate messiness. October 22nd. A crayon mark discovered on his bedroom wall, a deliberate act of filth. Following each entry was a chillingly dispassionate description of the purification ritual that followed. Leo was forced to scrub away the stain he had created. Not just the physical mark on the floor or the wall, but the stain of his imperfection. He was made to use the harsh chemicals and the stiff brushes, often for hours, until the spot was gone and his own skin was raw and weeping. The mark on his wrist wasn't from a single incident. It was the cumulative result of being forced to cleanse himself, to scrub away his own childhood. The drawing suddenly made perfect, horrific sense. The red scribbles weren't just anger. They were pain. The figure wasn't just holding a brush. It was holding the instrument of his torture. A volcanic fury rose in Elias, so potent it made him dizzy. It was the same battle rage he'd felt in the desert, the primal urge to meet violence with overwhelming force. He wanted to smash everything in this pristine, sterile house. He wanted to wait for Clara to return and confront her, to break her as she had tried to break Leo. But the soldier's discipline took over. A frontal assault was reckless. Clara was a master manipulator. She would twist the story, paint him as an unstable veteran, and use the system against him. Leo was the mission. His safety was paramount. A strategic victory required patience and overwhelming evidence. He forced himself to breathe, to calm the tremor in his hands. He took out his phone and quickly, silently, photographed the contents of the box and several pages of the journal. Then, with painstaking care, he placed every item exactly as he had found it. He closed the journal, placed it back on top of the brushes, and relocked the box, pushing it back into its hiding place. He wiped every surface he had touched. He left the house as silently as he had entered, the cold fury inside him now forged into a weapon. Sitting in his car down the street, he looked at the photos on his phone, the proof of Clara's systematic, psychological cruelty. He was no longer just an uncle. He was an operative, and he was gathering the intelligence needed to dismantle a monster from the inside out. The first call Elias made was to Marcus, a man from his old unit who now ran a successful private investigation firm. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Marcus, it's Thorne. I have a sensitive situation. I need a deep background check on my sister-in-law, Clara Thorne. I want everything. Juvenile records, sealed family court documents, financials, any past institutional stays. I need to know what broke her. And I need it yesterday." There was a pause on the other end. Then Marcus's low voice, full of unquestioning loyalty. "Consider it done, Eli. I'll get the ball rolling now." Back in the house, Elias was forced to maintain the facade of the visiting relative, a task that tested every ounce of his military discipline. Clara, oblivious to his discovery, suggested a trip to the local park. The entire outing felt like a surreal piece of theater. Clara performed the role of the doting mother flawlessly, smiling at other parents, buying Leo an ice cream cone which he ate with the painstaking neatness of a bomb disposal expert, and making bright, empty conversation. Elias played his part, pushing Leo on the swings, but his senses were on high alert. He was a scout on a reconnaissance mission deep in enemy territory. He observed the way Leo would watch other children laughing and tumbling in the grass, a deep, painful longing in his eyes, before his gaze would inevitably shift to Clara, checking her expression, gauging her mood. The park wasn't a playground for Leo. It was just another arena where he had to perform, where any misstep could lead to punishment. Elias felt Clara's constant, scrutinizing gaze on both of them, her control an invisible leash that kept Leo tethered to her. That evening, Elias found a way to create a small pocket of sanctuary. He sat on the floor of Leo's immaculate room with a set of wooden blocks he'd bought on his errand into town. He didn't pressure Leo to join him. He simply started building a tower, his movements slow and deliberate. He built in silence, concentrating on the simple act of placing one block on top of another. For 10 long minutes, Leo just watched him from his bed, his expression unreadable. Then, silently, he slid to the floor. He picked up a single blue block and, with a slightly trembling hand, placed it carefully on top of Elias's tower. He didn't look at Elias. He didn't smile. But it was a profound act of trust, a small gesture that declared an alliance. They sat there for nearly an hour, building in shared silence, creating something together in the sterile room that forbade creation. The true breakthrough came at bedtime. Clara was downstairs, the sound of a news program droning from the living room television. Elias tucked the blankets around Leo, the familiar ritual feeling heavier now with all that he knew. The room was dark, save for the soft glow of a nightlight. As Elias turned to leave, he felt a tiny, urgent tug on his sleeve. He stopped and leaned down, his ear close to the boy's mouth. Leo's voice was the barest of whispers, a sound like rustling leaves, so quiet it was almost lost in the silence of the house. "She makes the dirty go away," he breathed. The words, so simple and cryptic, landed like a gut punch. It wasn't just a phrase. It was a piece of decoded intelligence. It was the core of Clara's twisted ideology, the poisoned mantra she had forced into this child's mind. Leo wasn't being punished for being bad. He was being cleansed for being a child. For being dirty, Elias gently squeezed Leo's shoulder, a silent message of understanding. He now had the monster's motive, confessed from the lips of her victim. He walked out of the room, the whispered sentence echoing in his mind, the final piece of the psychological puzzle he needed to plan his assault. The encrypted email from Marcus arrived the next afternoon. Elias read it in the privacy of his rental car, the engine off, the suburban streets silent around him. The report was a portrait of a childhood spent in hell. Clara and Sarah's mother had not been the caring woman Sarah remembered through a filter of love and time. She was a severe hoarder with untreated mental illness. The file Marcus had unearthed from sealed county records detailed the squalor social workers had found in their childhood home. Rooms filled with refuse, filth, and decay. Clara, the older sister, had spent her formative years trying desperately to clean an uncleanable space, to create order out of pathological chaos, while being berated and punished by her mother for her failures. She was briefly removed and placed in foster care, described in the notes as an obsessive, fearful child who would scrub her own hands until they bled, before being inexplicably returned to the horde. Elias's cold rage was now tempered with a grim, sickening understanding. Clara wasn't just a monster born of malice. She was a broken victim perpetuating her trauma, projecting the filth of her own past onto the pristine canvas of her son. Any sign of normal childhood messiness, a muddy footprint, a spilled drink, wasn't an accident to her. It was a trigger, a terrifying manifestation of the decay she could never escape. It didn't excuse her actions, but it explained their horrific logic. The knowledge sharpened Elias's focus. This wasn't a person he could reason with or fix. She was a weapon programmed by her past, and Leo was her only target. The memory of Sarah's last request twisted in his gut. Be there for her, she had said. He had been, from thousands of miles away, completely blind to the fact that the person who needed protection from Clara was the boy he had sworn to protect for Sarah. That failure was a whetstone, honing his resolve to a razor's edge. The pressure of Elias's presence, his quiet observation and his budding connection with Leo, had clearly begun to destabilize Clara's fragile control. That evening, her composure finally cracked. At the dinner table, Leo, reaching for a piece of bread, accidentally knocked his fork from the table. It clattered loudly on the hardwood floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. Clara's mask didn't just slip, it disintegrated. "You clumsy, filthy boy," she hissed, her voice a low, venomous thing that was more terrifying than any shout. Before Elias could react, she lunged across the corner of the table and grabbed Leo's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his flesh. "What have I told you about being careful? About being clean?" Leo was paralyzed, his face a mask of pure terror, his eyes locked on his mother's contorted face. This was it, the moment of hostile action. Elias stood up, the legs of his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The sound was deliberate, sharp, a declaration. "Clara," he said. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it carried the unshakable authority of a commanding officer halting a firing squad. "Let him go." She froze, her head snapping toward him. Her eyes were wide with fury, but for the first time, there was also a flicker of fear. She saw the soldier. She saw the man who was no longer playing the part of the grieving brother-in-law. In that moment, she realized she had made a critical tactical error. She had revealed her true nature to a hostile witness. Slowly, deliberately, she released Leo's arm, her chest heaving. The perfect facade was shattered. Elias now had everything he needed: physical proof, witness testimony, psychological motive, and now a first-hand account of the abuse. The time for quiet reconnaissance was over. It was time to plan the final confrontation. The perfect venue for the ambush presented itself that Saturday: the annual community center bake sale, an event Clara helped organize. It was her stage, a place where she performed her role as a pillar of the community. It was public, surrounded by witnesses who saw her as a paragon of motherhood. It was perfect. Elias insisted they all go, framing it as a way to support her and a fun outing for Leo. Before they left, he made 2 calls. The first was to Mrs. Gable, a simple request: "Please be at the community center at 11. I might need a friendly face." The second was to Marcus: "Be near the community center on Elm Street. Have the report ready. When I give the signal, you make the call." The community center was bustling, filled with the cheerful noise of families and the sweet smell of baked goods. Clara was in her element, greeting people by name, her smile radiant, her control absolute. Elias waited, holding Leo's hand, his calm exterior belying the coiled tension within him. He chose his moment carefully, waiting until Clara was at the main table, surrounded by a small group of other parents. He walked toward her, his steps measured and deliberate. "Clara," he said, his voice calm and clear, just loud enough for those nearby to overhear. "I think Leo dropped this in his room. I found it this morning." He held out the folded piece of construction paper. Leo's drawing. The happy sun on one side, the nightmare on the other. Clara's smile froze on her face. She stared at the drawing, and a flicker of panic entered her eyes. "Oh, it's just a silly drawing," she said, forcing a little laugh that sounded brittle and sharp. "Kids and their imaginations." "Is it?" Elias replied, his voice never rising, yet cutting through the chatter around them. "He's very specific." The little boy in the dark room, the tall figure holding the brush. He saw a few of the other parents glance over, their curiosity piqued. "It reminds me of the things I found in that locked box under your sink, Clara. The brushes aren't for cleaning tile, are they?" Her face went pale. "I don't know what you're talking about," she whispered, her voice tight with fury. Her eyes darted around, seeing the attentive faces, the sudden halt in conversations. She was losing control of her audience. Mrs. Gable was standing a few feet away, her arms crossed, her expression grim and resolute. Elias leaned in slightly, his voice dropping into a near whisper that was somehow more devastating than a shout. "Marcus found the records, Clara. The social workers. The house you grew up in. They found you living in filth, didn't they? They took you away to try and clean you up." He looked directly into her eyes, seeing the terrified, broken child she had once been. "But you never really got clean, did you? And now you're trying to scrub the dirt out of him because you can't scrub it out of yourself." That was the detonation, the public naming of her deepest, most guarded shame. The carefully constructed walls of her sanity crumbled to dust. Her mind shattered. With a guttural scream of pure rage, she lunged. But she didn't lunge for Elias. She lunged for the source of her exposure, the filthy little boy who had betrayed her. "You told him!" she shrieked, her face a grotesque mask of hatred. "You wretched little snake! After everything I've done to make you perfect, to make you clean!" The room fell into a shocked, horrified silence. As Clara's hands, clawed and desperate, reached for him, Leo did something extraordinary. After a lifetime of terrified paralysis, he acted. He wrenched his hand free from Elias's and took a single, decisive step to place himself behind Elias's legs. He used his uncle as a shield. It was his first act of self-preservation, his first choice, his first vote of allegiance. Elias didn't move a muscle. He simply stood, a granite wall between the monster and the child. He met the horrified gaze of the people around them, his own expression hard and unyielding. Across the room, near the doorway, he saw Marcus lower his phone. The call had been made. The cavalry was on its way. The arrival of the authorities was swift and decisive, turning the chaotic tableau into a controlled scene. 2 police cruisers and an unmarked sedan from Child Protective Services pulled up to the community center, their silent, flashing lights painting the horrified faces of the onlookers in strokes of red and blue. Clara, who was still spiraling, began a frantic, hysterical attempt to spin a new narrative, babbling about Elias being an unstable, combat-traumatized soldier who was trying to kidnap her son. But her wild eyes and shrieking accusations only served to condemn her. Her credibility had evaporated in the heat of her public breakdown. A uniformed officer calmly intercepted her while a plainclothes social worker knelt down, creating a gentle barrier between the scene and Leo, who remained pressed tightly against Elias's leg. Then, Mrs. Gable stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. She spoke to another officer, her testimony a steady, damning account of everything she had seen. The joyless silence that had fallen over the house, the cold, cutting tone of Clara's voice drifting through summer windows, and the haunting image of a little boy forced to scrub steps in a thunderstorm. Emboldened by her courage, others began to speak. A teacher who was volunteering at the sale came forward to mention Leo's chronic exhaustion and his peculiar, fearful aversion to any art project that involved paint or clay, anything that could make a mess. The whispers of concern that had been shared over garden fences and in grocery store aisles coalesced into a chorus of truth. Acting on the detailed information Marcus had provided, the police secured an expedited warrant for Clara's house. The search was brief. They found the locked metal box under the bathroom sink. They found the industrial cleaner and the stiff-bristled brushes. They found the leather-bound journal, a meticulous record of her cruelty written in her own elegant hand. The physical proof was irrefutable, a perfect match to the mosaic of testimony that had been assembled at the community center. Elias watched as they escorted Clara to a police car. The mask of the perfect mother was gone, replaced by a terrifying blankness, the lights of her inner world extinguished. As the car pulled away, taking her out of Leo's life forever, a profound and heavy silence fell. The immediate battle was over. Elias looked down at the small boy still clinging to him, a child who had just witnessed the implosion of his entire world. The rescue was complete. The long, difficult mission of healing was just beginning. After hours of formal interviews and legal paperwork, Elias was granted emergency temporary custody of Leo. His first act as guardian was to drive Leo back to that silent, sterile house one last time. Accompanied by the social worker, he walked through the rooms that had been Leo's prison, the air still thick with the ghost of fear and the scent of bleach. The house already felt like a museum to a tragedy. Elias moved quickly, packing a small bag with Leo's clothes. In the back of the closet, tucked behind a row of perfectly stored shoes, he found a single, worn teddy bear, its fur matted from what must have been countless terrified grips in the dark. He added it to the bag. When it was time to go, he didn't let Leo walk out the front door. He lifted the boy into his arms and carried him over the threshold, a symbolic act of liberation. As he pulled the door shut for the final time, the click of the lock felt like a period at the end of a long, dark chapter. He didn't take Leo to a hotel. He took him to a small, furnished apartment he had preemptively rented on the other side of town. It was simple, anonymous, and, most importantly, it was new. It smelled of fresh paint and clean carpets, a wholesome cleanliness that was the opposite of Clara's sterile tyranny. For their first meal of freedom, Elias made grilled cheese sandwiches on the simple stove. They ate at a small wooden table, the bread a little burnt, the cheese oozing out the sides. It was a messy, imperfect meal. Leo ate his sandwich slowly, methodically. When he finished, he glanced at Elias, then quickly took the second half of his sandwich, scurried to the bedroom, and hid it under his pillow. The sight of it, a classic sign of a child used to food being withheld, was a dagger in Elias's heart. That night, the trauma surfaced. Elias was jolted from a light sleep by a scream from the other room. He rushed in to find Leo sitting bolt upright in bed, his eyes wide with a nightmare's terror, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Elias didn't speak. He simply sat on the edge of the bed and pulled the trembling boy into his arms, holding him firmly, a solid, unshakable anchor in the dark. He stayed there long after Leo's screams had subsided into quiet sobs, long after the sobs had softened into the steady breathing of sleep. He was a sentinel standing guard, vowing that no nightmare, real or imagined, would ever touch this child again. In the weeks that followed, the legal system moved with methodical purpose. Clara, faced with a mountain of evidence and a damning psychological evaluation, was declared unfit and committed to a long-term psychiatric facility. The courts awarded Elias full and permanent legal guardianship of his nephew. Justice had been clinical, quiet, and absolute. One evening, Elias stood in the doorway of Leo's new bedroom, watching him sleep. The small body was finally relaxed, the lines of fear around his eyes beginning to soften. Elias thought about his life as a soldier. Missions had a beginning and an end. You deployed, you completed the objective, and you came home. This mission was different. This deployment was for life. A profound sense of purpose, clearer than any order he had ever received, settled over him. He had failed to protect Sarah from an enemy he couldn't fight. He carried the ghosts of men he had lost in battle. But he had not failed Leo. This was his redemption. This was his peace. He made a silent vow to the sleeping child, a promise that was more sacred than any oath he had ever taken. I'm not going anywhere. I've got you. Forever. A year can be a lifetime. The silent apartment was exchanged for a small house with a scruffy yard and a fence that needed painting. The oppressive, sterile quiet of Clara's world was a distant, nightmarish echo, replaced by the chaotic, beautiful soundtrack of a life being lived. The air was filled with the clatter of Lego bricks on a wooden floor, the cheerful theme song of a cartoon, and the glorious, uninhibited sound of a child's laughter. Elias was in the kitchen, a smudge of flour on his cheek, trying to decipher a recipe for homemade pizza. Leo, now a sturdy 7-year-old, burst through the back door, his soccer cleats caked in mud, his face flushed with the joy of play. He left a trail of muddy footprints across the freshly cleaned linoleum floor. He stopped dead, his body freezing, his eyes widening with a flicker of an old, conditioned terror. The ghost of Clara was in the room. Elias looked from the muddy tracks to Leo's stricken face. A year ago, this moment would have been a catastrophe for the boy. Elias felt a surge of protective love so fierce it almost buckled his knees. He smiled. He knelt down, deliberately dipped his finger into one of the muddy prints on the floor, and gently streaked the dirt across Leo's cheek like war paint. "Looks like you've been captured by the mud monster," he said in a low, growling voice. Leo stared at him, his mind working to process this impossible reaction. And then, a sound bubbled up from deep inside him. A small giggle, then another, until it erupted into a full, free-bellied laugh. It was the most beautiful sound Elias had ever heard. Leo, his eyes sparkling with mischief, dipped his own finger in the mud and swiped it across Elias's nose. The spell was broken. The ghost was banished. A mess was just a mess. It was a sign of life, not a moral failing. They planted a garden in the backyard that spring, a small patch of earth for Sarah. As they worked, their hands buried in the cool, dark soil, Elias told Leo stories about his mother, how she loved the smell of rain, how she believed that all living things needed sunlight and water, and a little bit of chaos to grow strong. Later that night, curled up in bed, Elias read a chapter from a book about dragons and wizards. Leo was warm and sleepy, his head resting against Elias's chest, the weight of him both a comfort and a profound responsibility. In the quiet space between pages, Leo's small voice murmured, "Uncle Eli? Yeah, buddy? I love you." The three simple words were a declaration of victory, the final, unconditional surrender of fear to love. Elias's own voice was thick with emotion when he replied, "I love you too, kid." More than anything, he was no longer just a soldier. He was a father. His war was finally over, and he was, at long last, truly home. We build walls to keep our homes safe, to protect our families from the dangers of the outside world. But what happens when the greatest danger is already inside, smiling at us from across the dinner table? How do we learn to see past the perfect facade, the spotless floors, and the flawless performance of a life well lived? When a child falls silent, who is responsible for hearing the words they cannot say? The most terrifying monsters don't always have claws and fangs. Sometimes they have the key to the front door and a reputation for keeping a very clean house. Have you ever had a feeling deep in your gut that something was wrong, even when everything on the surface looked perfect? We invite you to share your story in the comments below.